Thank you for coming along to our webinar on different approaches to developing a theory of change. We're super excited to have so many of you. We've got about 200 people that have joined us from across Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Vanuatu, and the US. So that's pretty amazing that you could all get on here at the right time. Thank you for coming along. My name's Cam, and I'll be the host for today's session. I'm the head of the Academy, which is Clear Horizons' learning and development arm. We offer face-to-face courses that build practical skills in collaboration, design, and evaluation. All our courses are delivered by industry experts who do the things that they teach day in, day out. And we have 3 of these experts with us here today. You can see them hopefully on your screens. And they're going to be sharing their hard-won theory of change wisdom. So I look forward to hearing what they have to say. I'll get to introducing them in a moment, but first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all joining from today and pay my deepest respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In my case, I'm joining you from the lands of the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation in Byron Bay, and I pay my deepest respects to their elders. So a quick outline of how today is going to work. First, we'll find out a little bit about our panelists, get to know them a little bit before diving in and hearing a bit from you all. So we really want to get a sense of where you're at in your theory of change journey. If you do have any questions during the session, we will be opening up to questions after we go through the introductions. To do so, there should be a little Q&A button down the bottom when you hover your mouse over the screen. Click on that button and then type in your questions in the relevant space and hit enter. You can also upvote people's questions and make sure that those questions get to the top so that they're asked. You can also type any comments that you like in response to people's questions. So we'll be using that towards the end to field those questions and put them to the panelists. So now that we're clear on how today is going to run, it's my pleasure to introduce our 3 panelists for today. Firstly, we're joined by Dr. Jess Dart, who is the founder and CEO of Clear Horizon. Thanks for the wave, Jess. We've also got Lauren joining us, Lauren Siegmann, and she's a principal consultant also at Clear Horizon. And last but definitely not least, Damien Sweeney, who's another principal consultant at Clear Horizon. So thank you all very much for joining me. I'd now love to hear, starting with Jess, what are you most passionate about when it comes to your field of work? And you need to take yourself off mute, Jess.
Trap for beginners, eh? Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar. Yeah, what am I passionate about? Well, I'm pretty passionate about the work I do. And I think in particular, I'm going to draw it back to theory of change and evaluation and design. My passion is helping change makers to achieve their missions, whatever it is. So if you're trying to alleviate poverty, if you're trying to address systemic racism, whatever it is that you're trying to do, my passion is to equip you and people change makers with skills to adapt and evaluate and then design to be able to achieve those outcomes. So that's what I'm really passionate about, sort of a backstage helping role, I guess.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jess. And how about you, Lauren? What are you passionate about in this field of work?
Hi. Firstly, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm on today, people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders. And I'd also like to express my commitment to standing in solidarity with First Nations peoples and acknowledging the pain that has been done to First Nations communities in the past and finding a way forward. On that note, what I'm passionate about in my work is providing opportunities for beneficiaries and communities to lead evaluations themselves. And then connected to that, I'm very passionate about designing and using methods of evaluation that are user-friendly and accessible, and using simple and clear language in evaluation to facilitate that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. Damien.
Thanks, Cam. Hi, everyone. So a bit like Jess and Lauren, I'm really passionate about sort of working with people with in teams to really develop good project designs and just sort of avoiding the situation of a solution in search of a problem, which is really quite common, unfortunately. In having done many evaluations, one of the common findings out of that is that, the importance of having a good design at the start. If you don't have a good design, the implementation will unfortunately not be that great. So that's where, theory of change and program logics or logical framework approaches come in.
Great. Thank you very much, Damien. All right, so now that we've heard from the panelists, we'd love to hear from you all. So we've got a poll that we're going to bring up in a moment, and that poll will be asking you to share your level of familiarity with theory of change. 1 being not so familiar at all, 5 being okay, and 10 being very familiar. So pop in your selections there, and we'll bring up the results in a moment. We should be playing thinking music as we do this. And how are we going, Keisha? Ready to share the results, you reckon?
Just about.
Great, okay. Another couple of seconds just to get your final results in. Got a question from Lee. Can you sing? I can sing. I might do that a bit later. We'll see how we go.
I wouldn't do that to the audience.
I'll go grab my guitar if you're really lucky.
Oh, you think you've got a lovely voice, Cameron. It'd probably be very nice to hear your voice.
Okay, and looks like we've got the results coming up soon. Here we go. Okay, great. So quite a spread up towards the higher end in terms of familiarity, which is interesting. So 27% saying 7, 18% on 8. So quite a fairly advanced group, which is great to see. So it's really good to know where you're at. So we'll pitch our responses more towards that advanced end of the spectrum, I think, panelists, if we can. So thank you for joining us in that poll. We've now got another poll very quickly. And the second question is, what terms are you familiar with in relation to this topic? So I believe you can select all of the terms that are relevant to you. So there's lots of different ways that theory of change is spoken about. Select all the ones that you're familiar with. Kerry says, Jess, I like your background. It looks like you're in Byron Bay as well, Jess.
Oh yeah, if only. I'm actually in my bedroom, like a lot of people at the moment.
And Damien's on a plane, wish fulfillment via Zoom background.
It's very windy outside, Damien's.
All right, let's launch those results if we can, Keisha. Let's see what we've got. Okay, unsurprisingly, theory of change has pretty much 100%. That's good to see. You're all in the right place. Program logic looks like it's the second most voted for, followed by outcomes frameworks. And then the others are lagging behind: theory of action, outcomes pathways, impact pathways, each getting around 29 to 30%. So great. So we'll also bear this in mind as we go through in terms of your familiarity. If we're using concepts that maybe the group isn't so familiar with, it might help to explain the differences between them. Great. Okay, so now we get started. So we're going to open up for the first question, and this is a question we'll start with you, I think, Jess. What is a theory of change, and where and when can it be used?
Okay, so what is a theory of change? So I guess we might all have slightly different versions of this, but for me, a theory of change is actually a really powerful thinking tool. So it's not a design and it's not a measurement framework, none of those things. It's often a messy, starts with a messy diagram often that we use to get clear together in a group about how we believe change is going to happen. So that's basically, for me, it's a messy diagram to get clear. Often, like we used to do mind maps when we were doing essays, when we were kids, we'd do a messy diagram first to get clear, and then we'd write the essay. So I feel like that's what a theory of change is. It's a backstage tool to get really clear on what it is you're trying to achieve. And it's all about outcomes. It's all about what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And when you've got your messy diagram, you can turn that into a narrative. So it can be expressed as a narrative. It doesn't have to be a diagram, but it often starts with a diagram. Lots of different ways of diagramming it, no one way. So there's a lot of variety there. But ultimately, it should be about cause and effect relationships. It should be part of that. It's a dynamic tool, so it's not a one-off thing. It should be adapted as you learn. And depending on the context that you're using it, that might be quite a lot of adaptations if you're doing it in more of a design phase. It can be done at loads of different levels. So you can do it for a project and a small level, or a program, or an organization. You can do it for the world. You can think about everything that needs to change and how change will fit together to achieve the sort of desired outcomes that you're after. So big, messy model to help you think about how change happens. That's basically my my approach to it. Is that enough? Really good?
That's great. Thanks, Jess. Super clear. Love that idea of a messy spaghetti diagram. It often ends up a bit like that, but a great mind mapping tool. Okay, great. So we're going to open now to Damien. What's the difference between theory of change and log frame?
So thanks for that again for the question. And it's one of those questions that can spark furious debates. With sort of log frames stirring both positive and negative reactions in people. And I think I'm one of the few people in the maybe getting person clear horizon still keeping the log frame dream alive. Much to Jess's probable horror, but people often confound log frame with a logical framework approach, and there's two different things. So a log frame is just one step in the systematic approach, which is the logical framework approach, and it's a thinking through a problem. It's about thinking through the problem and the possible solutions. Anybody can sit at their desk and knock up a log frame, and I think that's probably where the issues with log frames have been done. But that's the same thing with theory of change. I can sit at my desk right now and knock up a theory of change, but it's the process that's important. And the process is the sort of like you said, the messy process. That brings out the usefulness of the final product. Now, logical framework approach, as opposed to the log frame, if done well, provides that participatory approach, which I think Lauren will talk about probably more in more detail. But it's that identifying the problem, looking at doing the problem analysis, which provides you with a problem tree, and then when you flip the problem tree to a solution tree, that provides something very similar to an overarching theory of change. So like identifies how change will happen, and that's through identifying the pathway that you want to work on. That's when you can develop a log frame. So a log frame is more like a program logic at a very specific project level or program level, and it provides a bit of a roadmap for intervention, combined with sort of like a basic effectiveness monitoring plan. Where are log frames really useful? They're still useful. They're really good for infrastructure projects, like basic infrastructure projects, whether that's renewable energy or water harvesting. I've travelled around the Pacific region, working around a lot of government people there in teaching and training on how to do log frames, and it's a really useful tool for projects in the Pacific in terms of like water harvesting, things like that, where the theory of change can become a bit abstract sometimes. And so, sort of like basic infrastructure, and if you sort of apply the Kinefin framework, which we always like to bring out, it's good for sort of simple and complicated projects. And even at the moment, you can combine the log frame with a theory of change. It's Keisha is on this webinar as well. And we're using that approach in PNG for an infrastructure project where there's a theory of change or a program logic at the overarching program level, and within that there's a whole lot of nested projects, and we're applying a log frame approach to the Untitled project. Probably I can have chat for hours on log frames, but it's probably another whole webinar as well.
Thanks, Damien. We've got a few requests if there's any way to either move your microphone closer to your mouth, just so we can hear you a bit clearer. Your volume's dropping in and out. Might ask Keisha to support you with that on the back end. There's an audio setting. If you click into audio settings and then untick adjust automatically volume and slide that volume slider up, that should help you get it a bit clearer. Thanks for letting us know you're having troubles out there. All right, my question for Lauren, what makes a great theory of change from your perspective?
Hi, I just want to say for starters that I actually think log frames are a great tool that have been unfairly maligned because they've been often used by donors in situations that aren't very conducive to the purpose. Am I also the same problem with sound? It's just better when I hold it like this. So I think log frames, it's time for us to do a bit of reputation building. I'm not sure what I can do about the sound. Maybe if I take my microphone out, would that help a bit? Does it sound better or worse when I take the microphone off?
Lauren.
Hmm?
Better without. Yeah.
Better without. Okay, I'll leave it without then. But it made me look more professional. Okay, thanks everyone. Sorry, apologies for that. Yeah, it's time to do a bit of reputation restoration of the log frame and see it getting used a bit better in the future, I think. I'm personally a bit traumatised from the European Commission log frame, so that's not why we're here to talk. What makes a theory of change great is when it combines multiple perspectives, because programs are usually collective efforts of multiple stakeholders, funders, implementers, beneficiaries. So you need to make sure that everyone's having an opportunity to have their perspective blended in the theory of change. That's really an opportunity to get everyone together to nut out these things, rather than finding out 3 years down the track that no one agreed on what the actual theory of action was for the program. But for me, in my work, a great theory of change also privileges the perspectives of communities and people who are expected to benefit from the theory of change. So normally in a theory of change, you have people that you expect to see change from the theory. So therefore, it stands to reason that they are the ones whose perspectives need to have prominence in the theory of change. The other thing, what makes a great theory of change is that it's presented to audiences in different ways that make sense to them. So I often will present theories of change as a narrative, as a story, as a video, as a table, or as a diagram. And then that way, it all contains the same information, but you have a maximal short chance that people are going to engage in a way that they understand. Thanks, Cameron.
I love that, Lauren. I love the idea of having all these different formats and ways of doing it. And in a way, a log frame, the actual table, is another format that works for some people and not others.
That's right.
So I think people like to receive the information in different ways, depending on how they prefer it. Some people don't like messy models. Me, I'm a messy model sort of a person.
I'm glad this has been recorded, Jess, just so I can hear those words again about log frames.
You can see we have internal fights here, but
so when I do a theory of change, I'll often have a diagram, a table, a story, and a narrative. And then when you give it to people, it's interesting to see that they will naturally gravitate to the format that they prefer. And then you've been successful in communicating it.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, Lauren. I love that idea of producing it in the modality that most makes sense for the people you're working with.
Yeah.
Yeah, and bringing in and privileging the perspectives of those the program is designed to benefit.
Yeah.
Seems obvious, but surprising how often that doesn't happen.
Well, I don't always do it either, because you get work happens, and you get priorities and deadlines, and things that you say are best practice in a webinar fall away. So it's a good opportunity for me to remember what I'm here for.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to emphasise that they're not mutually exclusive, and I think there's a process, that's one component, and then there's the product. So it depends on how you refer it. Like a log frame is a product, just like a theory of change diagram is a product, and they are similar. There's the process of undertaking to get to that stage, which is really a critical part, and that's where in the past DFAT started out with a great guideline on developing logical framework approach, and then they went to theory of change. It's now program logic. And the thing is, they're terms, but if you don't apply, the term is the term, and it's how you apply that process. And when you don't apply the process, you can't blame the final product if it's not effective or not useful.
And you'd agree that it's all about getting clear on cause and effect, no matter how you do it. At the end of the day, you've got to think about how change happens, and it's all about change, isn't it? Whichever tool you use.
It is, yeah, and like Lauren said, it's about the participatory approach to that, because if you do it yourself or with a small group of like-minded people, you don't bring all those viewpoints which are critical to understanding the problem. And that's what we do is we just have confirmation bias. We see the world in our own eyes, and the technical specialist will approach it with a technical solution, rather than understanding the lived experiences of people, of beneficiaries, of other stakeholders, of other actors, and things like that.
Great. Thanks, everyone. That was a very comprehensive answer. All right, so the next question is, what are the 3 key steps in developing a theory of change? And we might start, I think, with Jess again.
Okay. Right, I've got 3 steps. Although the first one is scope, okay? So the first thing is to find out how it's going to be used, because that dictates everything else. So theory of change is used in very many different ways. It can be used in a design setting or an evaluation setting, and then who is it for? So I would never start without scoping it properly to try and understand the context in which it's being used and the purpose. Once you've worked all that out, the next big step for me, step 2, is to map out the what. And that's the big picture or the mission level outcomes. What it is, the big change that you're trying to achieve. You need to get clear about that. So the what needs to be clear. You might look at a bit of evidence to get to back that up and make that really good, but you need to get the what sorted. When the what's sorted, you can move on to the how. How do we think change can occur to get to these mission outcomes? And so the how is all about mapping the cause and effect pathways or the impact pathways and getting clear on the cause and effect. We can't do that until you've got your sort of high level what clear. So scope, and then map out the what, and then thirdly, map out the how. I have to say though, depending on, because I work sometimes as an evaluator with an existing program, and then sometimes I'm working in the messy design space where the activities are not yet decided. And so I actually work differently in both of those spaces. And if I walk into a program that already is running as an evaluator, and I'm really just clarifying the theory of change, I cheat totally. Get clear on the outcomes at the top, I stick the activities in the bottom, and I work on the missing middle. And this is a lot easier than actually when you're in a design phase and you're actually trying to decide on what are the right levers, what are the right activities to pull. It's a much more extended process. Okay, so it depends. That's everything.
Thanks, Jess. Lauren, anything to add to that?
I would say my answer would be very similar to Jess, but so I would think 3 stages. There's planning, gathering, reflecting, which I think Jess basically summarises the steps that Jess said. I think also within the planning stage, there should be a purposeful discussion around whose perspectives need to be reflected, and then connected to that, a discussion around how to manage power and dynamics within those discussions is always helpful, even if it's just among the evaluators doing the work. And then the gathering, I think also you need to be mindful of the synthesis of multiple perspectives and how you're going to manage that. And then also thinking about how to manage that in a way that makes sense for your audience, which speaks to what I was saying in my earlier response. And then also for reflection, I think also the end point of, there shouldn't be an end point of a theory of change. It should be an iterative document that is constantly reviewed and refined, because that will reflect program learning and adaptation.
And can I just chip in, Lauren? You often use stories first before you develop the framework, which is a really novel approach that I love that you use, that works really well with grassroots community. Where does that part fit in your steps?
Well, it can fit into any point of the step really, but also I'd like to say that I came up with that method after working with government staff in the Victorian government, who I once did a program logic workshop, and in the morning we got staff to talk about stories of times in the past that they were doing good community engagement. And then in the afternoon we got them to do the traditional program logic structure, you know, activities, immediate outcomes for a program goal. And it was really interesting because in the stories in the morning session, they spoke very deeply and with nuance around the way that change happened and how they created change and then what the change was. But then when we got them to do the traditional program logic workshop, none of that deep nuance was reflected in their work in the program logic. So then from there, I started using stories as a way to gather information about how people perceive how change happens, and then also what kind of change they see happening. And stories are basically program logics in that they describe a causal pathway.
It's a very cool method.
It's basically MSC.
Yeah, but that's before it, and then the theory of change. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's MSC before.
That's most significant change for anybody who doesn't know what MSC is. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's all like, you know, there's no original ideas, Jess. I took your work and further developed it.
It's cool.
So standing on the shoulders of giants.
That's what Bob Dylan did, right, in songwriting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to add on to that, often, you know, we use terms like outputs or outcomes, intermediate outcomes, objectives, and those can be, you know, understood differently by different people. So in my work around the Pacific, around log frames, you know, we kind of, in each country, we worked with the participants to translate what an outcome was or what a purpose was in the local language, so people can have a discussion around, well, what does that mean in our context? And I think that's important because there's all these terms that can be thrown around in content evaluation.
You don't really need those terms, do you? I mean, the labels up the side, you can throw them out. It really is about how you understand change. I've done it before with just like, you know, the who, the what, and the why as the levels up the side. And that worked just as well. So I think people shouldn't get too caught up in what levels they are up the side. Yep. They're only supposed to be guides. And if they're getting in the way, chuck them out.
We often at Clear Horizon use participatory workshops to develop theories of change, and then we bring in very technical knowledge. I remember, you know, rewind like 15 years ago when I first learned about theories of change, I actually really struggled with them for a very long time conceptually. I didn't really understand them very well for a very long time. And I put it down to that we have different ways of like integrating knowledge. I'm very experiential and less like rational. And so it just didn't speak to how I make sense of the world. So you have to also consider how people make sense of things, and not everyone can immediately get on board with that very structured process. So you have to really try to meet these people where they're at. And I'll never forget how hard I found it. So I'm just mindful of that when I ask people to come in and engage with it.
And what was it that supported you to get over that hurdle in the end, Lauren?
Experience. Like I kept doing it badly for years until I got good at it.
Lauren does it very well. How about you, Damien, though? Because you often do a problem analysis first, which is a different starting point, isn't it?
Yes, because I think well, a problem analysis allows everyone to get first to agree on what the problem is, because often what I see or what a donor might see as a problem is not necessarily the problem from the viewpoint of you know, the beneficiaries or other actors. So a good problem analysis is really important, just getting that common agreement, because if not everyone's on board the same ship, you're not going to be sailing in the same direction. So it's that, for me, that's a problem. You know, that's really important. And also a good starting point, you know, it's a good point as a foundation for developing the theory of change, because you do that causal analysis and in a participatory manner. And, you know, often I bring in sort of behavior change frameworks and models there, because, you know, sort of the problems, you know, that a lot of the problems we work with have a behavior change element, and often the default is we're going to just sort of give knowledge, and knowledge will lead to attitude, which will lead to, you know, change in practice. But there's been a lot of research in behavior change, you know, that shows that link doesn't, you know, it's not the standard link. And I think sort of having just even a basic idea of basic understanding of behavior change is really important. So you understand that, you know, behavior change is not just about knowledge. There's other things like, you know, norms, And as things like convenience, regulations, rules, and all that affect the changes, you know, how to achieve.
So you're really talking about using scholarly knowledge and evidence to sort of inform the theory of change. And that's one way to get them a lot more sophisticated, isn't it? Is to tap in to the existing scholarly knowledge. And behaviour change theory has a whole body of knowledge about how change happens. But there are other frameworks as well that you can use, of course, as well as behaviour change, like in theory of empowerment, you know, for the tipping change models and so forth.
It prompts to kind of go, well, what, you know, to achieve the outcome, what's blocking it? Is it just knowledge, or, you know, how do I, and then try and trigger questions to the group, you know, the participants, you know, to see, you know, or are there rules and regulations that prevent you? Are there norms? Are there, you know, what is it? Is it just, you know about the right thing to do, but you just can't access, you know, the materials or the other factors that are required. And what I recommend, you know, if you want a sort of basic primer in behaviour change, Doug Mackenzie-Moore, who I've sort of worked with in the past, he's got his website, cbsn.com. He's got a book on they call fostering sustainable behaviour, and it's a really good resource in terms of this.
Maybe you could add that into the chat function for the audience.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So that I'd just like to sort of draw the differences between the three of us a little bit. So in terms of the steps we use, there are different entry points, aren't there, for doing theory of change, and different orders. So like Lauren used stories as a starting point. Damien has talked about using problem analysis and also dipping into theories to sort of fuel the process. I've sort of like talked about the importance of basically scoping and then drawing out a big picture. So there's lots of different ways that you can start and inform theory of change. It very much depends on the context and what you're trying to do, don't you think? Because if you're working in a very community context where people don't like frameworks, they don't like Western models, and sometimes people really don't get into this stuff, you know, a story-based approach might be a really good way to go. If you're in a design context where everything's moving and swirling, there's no point in really going too far on the evidence straight away, because that's exactly what you're going to do. You're going to throw your best ideas out, do it roughly, and then you're testing against evidence, all sorts of different evidence, user testing, prototyping, looking at scholarly evidence, and you're going to test it all. But you might have 10 or 20 versions of your theory of change by the time you're finished. So you've got to start somewhere. So just throw it up and then test. So, you know, it really does depend which context you're in, whether you're in evaluation or a design context, whether you're working with community or in a more sort of bureaucratic environment. So I think it's really important to be flexible around how you work.
Yeah.
Sounds like also something that's coming through there is don't be precious about your model. Be prepared to chuck it out, cross things off, remove things.
Well, yeah, that's the way I approach it. I mean, I think maybe I started off with my favourite approach. I've been doing it for, God, you know, I realise I've been doing this for 25 years. So when I started, I probably thought you did it in a certain way, and then I got knocked over and I had to have another go. And then I maybe learned 2 ways, and then you learn 3, and then you learn 4. And one day you realise that there are actually a lot of different ways of doing it, and you've got to try and craft the approach to the context. So that's what I would say to people. If you're new at this, learn one way, that's great. Then learn another way. Then you got 2. Then learn 3, and then choose the right one and go like that. But it is really important to learn different approaches if you really want to do theory of change in a very effective and strategic manner. Yeah. Should we talk about evidence, Cam? Because I think that's a really important feature here, is how we use evidence. I'm sure the audience would be pretty keen to understand the different ways in which evidence might be used. Should we go to that? I was just thinking, you know, who would like to start on that? Do you want to talk about how you use evidence, Loz? Lauren?
Well, for me, because I do a lot of work on community with beneficiaries, I normally use the evidence of the viewpoint of the community as the starting point for the program logic. But also I use research to tell me more about the problem. So I would do a kind of problem analysis, but I may do it before or after the story collection, which seems counterintuitive. But community also normally have a good idea of the problem. So for evidence, I use research, but I tend to only use it for just diagnosing the problem. I actually find getting evidence of interventions really difficult to make sense of. It's very rare that you're going to find an evidence-based intervention that is going to fit very neatly into the kind of context that you're using the program logic for. We talk a lot about having evidence-based approaches, but I think I'd like to see a little bit more sophistication in our discipline around what that actually looks like practically, because I find it very hard to find evidence of other interventions that would translate very neatly into whatever I'm particularly working in. So then for the development of the theory of change, it's really evidence from the literature about the problem, and then evidence from the perspectives of the people that I'm talking to, and then you test your theory of change, building your own evidence.
So there's a lot of different types of evidence, really, aren't there? It really means what you mean, scholarly, but like views of people. And then the sort of horizon, I call them horizon scans, which is where you look across at existing practices. We will often, when we're in a design process, we'll often do what's called a horizon scan, and we'll look for, like, around the world, 10 examples of how people have done this before. So it's sort of like existing practices, scholarly literature, and also what people, actually, the lived experience is really important, isn't it? How about you, Damien?
Before we go to Damien, sorry, we've got a really interesting question here from Kate that refers to what we're talking about. So Kate asks, what's the role of existing literature, evidence and theory in the process? What if it conflicts with people's opinions and stories?
I think that's a great question, because I think perceptions are just as important as facts. And I think it goes back to, the viewpoints of, like Lauren said, in terms of participation and things like that. Just because a technical specialist might see a fact there, it's not necessarily, everything is political and everything is different. Things like evidence-based decision making, it's always a great term, because I love how politicians use that when it suits them, and then they disregard it in other situations. Just look at climate change; it's a great area for when you look at evidence-based decision making. In terms of evidence, for me, and that goes back to the logical framework approach. If you look at the logical framework approach, it's a systematic process. The first step is doing that sort of situation analysis. So, what current information is there to around the issue, and that ideally, even just evaluation reports from previous projects should inform that if you actually find those evaluation reports, and assuming that they're really well done too. But yeah, so like document reviews, things like that. And then the next step in logical framework approach is that sort of stakeholder analysis, speaking to people, speaking to the beneficiaries, speaking to other actors that are involved in the process, both for and against potentially, because you need to know where the barriers are, the blockages are. So I think it's it's really important to get all that evidence before and that can help you develop the theory of change or your problem tree or your solution tree and things like that.
I just want to come back to the question around the conflict. For me, and this represents my values, I'll go with what the community wants over what the research tells me. But in an ideal world, I would communicate the research to the community. But if they don't agree with it, then I'm not going to push them into something that's not going to work for them. So also, if you only ever do things that are based in research, then no innovation ever happens, which is what Jess's point was earlier. So it's tricky, but also just remember that the theory of change is a hypothesis that gets tested through evaluation.
My point is that theories of change are never finished and they're never right. Then you can't do that. So it's always a journey. The aim is to have an increasingly sophisticated and shared understanding of what it is you're trying to do, including community. So I mean, like, it's complex how you work with community. I mean, you want the community equipped. It's ideal if they examine the evidence themselves and are informed by it and test their own assumptions. Community, like everybody else, need to learn. We're all learning, okay? So we all need to challenge our own assumptions. But often scholarly evidence is written for a different context. And context is everything in theory of change, because that's why we do theory of change. in communities, in settings, is because every situation is unique. If it wasn't, we'd just take it out of a book. We wouldn't ever need to do it in a workshop. We'd just take it out of the book and it's done. So we can't take it out of the book because that book wasn't written in our context. Our context includes lived experience, the people who live there, their experience of things. And that's where we learn about that. So it's a tussle, isn't it, between the evidence on one hand and the views, but ideally you go on a journey together to test that.
The evidence from implementation and monitoring, goes back into changing or to modifying the theory of change, because I think, it's often this concept that, you develop it as a design and therefore the rest of the implementation has to be against that change. But it's an iterative process, and I think you can kind of look at it as the theory of intended change at the start, and then you get the theory of actual change at the end. It's a story, and that's sort of like that tic-tac rather than just talk.
So your tick. You better tell people about your tick and your talk.
Tic-tac. No, the theory of intended change being the tick, and the theory of actual change being the tack. I was trying to make it TikTok, but
it didn't quite work. But yeah, I think it depends on how settled a program is, doesn't it? Like, I was thinking that if you've got a really settled program and you're going in to evaluate it, you get clear about the key assumptions that are underpinning the program, then that's what you look at. You look at those and see what evidence back those up. And you may be doing that through the implementation of the program. If the assumptions don't hold up, you're not going to get your outcomes. So that's a really good spot to look at. So I use evidence in different ways, depending very much on the level of how settled something is and the context. And I think another point of evidence is often we bring people into a room, like we use a lot of workshops, don't we? And today, online workshops too. And we're expecting people to bring their evidence with what they know. And these can be experts and community with lived experience, and bring all of those viewpoints together and like smash it together is a really effective and fast way of bringing evidence. So it's evidence by way of a person almost, which is often what we use. So we do use literature reviews and look at the scholarly theory and test assumptions, but by way and far, the biggest form of evidence is by bringing people together, isn't it? Don't you think?
Yeah, it is. When you do that sort of problem analysis and someone says, the cause of this is that, it's often good to go, well, what evidence do you have to back that up? Because it's, is it just this is the hunch, or do you actually have evidence?
Yeah, we have it.
Why don't you do that? Because I don't know about it. How do you know they don't know about it? Maybe they do know, they just don't. There's other reasons, and that goes back to the behaviour change sort of frameworks. Are there other reasons? You need to search.
So we're increasingly seeing theory of change as an iterative process, aren't we? I think we're very influenced because we've been doing more and more human-centered design or user-centered design work, where you sort of like you iterate and test your ideas with evidence and with user and with users themselves or with community. And like you know that you don't know, that you start off with a sort of naive theory of change, and the idea is to make it more sophisticated. But are we ready to move on?
Yeah, I'm going to move you along. I want to make sure we have enough time to get to more audience questions. But before we do, a very quick question. I'd love just a very brief response from each of you. What's your number one rule when you're developing a theory of change?
Oh.
Might start with Lauren. We haven't heard from her for a while.
I would just say, I feel like I'm getting a bit repetitive now. I would just say I would use methods that communicate the language and constructs of the theory of change that are in ways that are best suited for the audience.
Go on, Damien. You go next.
Damien. Let's go with Damien.
I think it's probably a bit repetitive, but it's participation, whether that's individual interviews with people or group interviews or seeing everybody together in a room or in a Zoom session, just getting that people to be involved in the process, because the process is critical to what you get at the end, sort of like rubbish in, rubbish out.
Awesome. Thanks.
My rule is, because it's a model, it's not reality, it's never right, and it's never finished. Therefore, my rule is trade off a little bit of logic for ownership and framing it in the way people in their way in the group, how they understand reality, if you like, in the way they see it. So I'll push, and then I'll go, okay, they, you know, get rid of forget the logic. That's how they see it. Capture that. So trade off some logic for ownership. That's my rule.
Thanks, Jess. All right, let's open to a question from the group. The most popular question, most upvoted, is from Anthony Bailey. Anthony asks, you mentioned constant review of theory of change. How often do you think a program should review theory of change, especially within a 3 to 4 year program / contract?
I can tell you my view and then we can argue it out if you like. Shall we do that?
Let's do that.
So like, it depends on the nature of the program. I feel like I'm saying depends all the time, and how much turbulence there is, and you know, whether you're actually doing an adaptive program or something that's fairly settled and known. For something that's sort of fairly straightforward and settled and known, I see that theories of change get refined every year. In a 3-year program, that might be 3 or 4. That's a typical sort of starting off knowing what you're doing, so every year. But if you start working in an adaptive context of things like governance, where you're really learning and you're not sure how you begin, or you're working in innovation, like in an innovation program, you might have to do it you might have to adapt it much more often than that, or you might be adapting parts of it at one time as you're building it out. So it may be like you're tweaking it in a design phase. I was working on a design last year, and it was a 3-month process, and we did 10 iterations of the theory of change. But that was it was a design intervention. We were iterating and learning and trying. So it really does depend what you're doing. A traditional program that's more settled, maybe once a year. A actual design journey, you know, every week, every day, maybe. We had a big magic wall up on, and every time we learned something new, we'd run back and change it and fix it up, and then we'd run away. We go, oh no, that's not right, fix it and move it. And we had it on a magic wall where we moved things around constantly as we learned. We use it a place to bring back our learnings. And equally in turbulent context, post-conflict, right now, when everything's changing, you know, I'm changing the Clear Horizons strategy every week to understand and respond to the changing context. So it depends on how fast the context is changing and whether you're in a design mode or a settled mode.
I feel like you should change your screen name to Jess Dart. It depends.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah. I used to be so much more clear about everything. It's what happens when you get old. What do you reckon, Lauren?
Well, I think I would say similar to what you're saying, but also I think it's important to delineate sometimes between formal and informal revisions. So when I work with good program managers, I notice that they are natural evaluators. They scan the environment, they will redo the theory of change in their head and then come up with adaptations to suit it without ever actually writing out what a theory of change is. But they actually do have a very structured theory of change in their mind, and it actually they use it to make good decisions about the program. So then the issue then becomes around bringing in multiple stakeholders, being accountable for your decisions, and using evidence for formal evidence for your accountability. But like I know, like people will informally be changing the theory of change. In an ideal world, I would advocate for a very rapid, like 3 months review of theory of change. But if you want to be thorough about it and have multiple stakeholders involved, that's a great way to make everyone fatigued very quickly.
Yeah.
Practically, I would suggest that programs should be doing a formal reflection on the theory of change once a year, because that's going to be very realistic, and it also gives you time to actually let some change happen between reflections. But knowing that really, in reality, people are always amending the theory of change in their heads.
Yeah,
Thanks, Lauren.
Anthony. I think it's the same Anthony that I know. So thanks for coming on board to the webinar. I agree with Jess. I think at the minimum, at least once a year, sort of if you have an annual reflection process where you kind of review the year's evidence, you know, that's a great opportunity to revise. And like Jess said, if it's a highly changing situation, or there's an event that creates a change, like the pandemic, that's a good opportunity, and it's also to revise the theory of change. When I used to sort of train in the logical framework approach and log frames, I used to tell people, if you start doing activities that are outside your log frame, and then what you've said you're going to be doing, that's a good time to question, well, why am I doing that? Am I doing scope creep, or am I doing something because it's required? It's not in my log frame, so therefore it's time to revise your log frame. So I think it's just, if you start doing things which you hadn't planned, that's a good time to start revising, thinking about, well, why am I doing that?
It's a great bit of guidance there. Thanks, Damien. Really easy to implement or action. All right, we'll go to the next question, which is from Graham Francis. People are always tempted to look for their first best fix. Do the panelists have any advice about how to engage program and project managers in the kind of authentic scanning of the territory around a problem you are advocating for before racing to a few obvious solutions too early in the piece?
That reminds me of my project that I went to when I turned up, and they all had T-shirts on, which was training for development. And I was like, aren't we going to work out what we're going to do? And they all had T-shirts, training for development. It's like, don't put your T-shirt on. Think about what the right thing is to do. Yeah, that was just my anecdote. But
training for ...
Yeah. So yeah, how do you get people it's very common that people get stuck in one way of delivering one idea. Oh, we'll just run a workshop, or we just do capacity building, or that's what we always do. And it might not be the right intervention. So how do you break people out of that? I'm sure we've all got different ideas. I like to give people sort of archetypes of theories of change, and really simple ones, and get them to think of every one. Like we talk about the carrot and the stick, the persuasion model, the empowerment model, and the partnership model. We just explain them and say, just think about all of them first before you decide. And just get people thinking a bit more broadly. So that's one little way. What's the ways that you get them to think more broadly, Loz? And Damien, you go, maybe Damien.
Yeah, I think everybody wants to jump to action, and everybody wants to, you don't want to fund background research and the stuff that you don't see, that you don't get sort of products with. But it's a bit, for me, project design and developing a theory of change, it's like painting a room. Nobody wants to sugar soap and remove all the stuff. You just want to start painting stuff because you get a direct result. But like Jess said, I've seen so many workshops. What are we going to do? Run a workshop. That's going to change the world. And it doesn't. It just means that the same people come to the same workshop because they get free food and things like that. It doesn't bring the change you want. So it's really going back to identifying, well, what are the causes of the problem, and spending time before jumping to the solution, because everybody has a solution, and then which research of the problem. That's kind of, you see that.
So hold them off. Don't let them talk about activities too soon.
Just go back. Why? Why are we doing? Why do you think that's going to work? Doing that research.
How do you get it, Loz? How do you get people not to do?
Well, it hasn't really been an issue for me in my work, but what I was thinking about as you were both talking was one thing that we haven't talked a lot about so far is power dynamics. So if like a depth set comes to me and tells me that something needs to be implemented immediately, that's going to be my response to that is going to be very different to if I'm managing a team and the team wants to do something immediately and I want to encourage them to have more time to think. Like, so much of our work is bound by power dynamics, and it's not always easy to deal with those when it's people who are holding the purse strings or have the power decide that they want to implement things. I mean, it happens all the time in government.
You often get the ministerial announcement, we will do this, and then somehow you've got to put that into your program logic, which actually links to another question.
That links to the next question, exactly, yeah. So I'm interested to hear some perspectives about how useful it is or can be to retrofit program logic where an organization already has its activities and deliverables bedded down into a contract that wasn't put together based on a theory of change. How do we make this authentic and valuable rather than cobbling together what we already do, but trying to give it more legitimacy or better framing?
I normally do two. I do a secret one for the team to help them deliver a good program, and then I give them another one to give to the people that are controlling the program. I don't know if that was the right thing for me to say, but that's what I would do.
There's often more than one. Yeah, I mean, when you work as an evaluator, this is the common context, isn't it? You come in maybe halfway through, the program's running and you're asked to evaluate it. And we always say, well, we can't evaluate it until we understand what you're trying to do here and what your activities are and how you think you're going to get to outcome. So we often spend some time trying to clarify the theory of change so that we can develop measures or an evaluation framework. So we do this a lot, don't we? It's a bit frustrating though. It's not frustrating for us. It's frustrating for the people we're doing it with, because I remember once we got brought in to do this, to evaluate a strategy, and we did the same thing. We got to clarify the theory of change, and it was 3 years in, and we did the theory of change and we worked out, we put it all up. We put the activities in, we put the outcomes on, we tried to map the middle. And at the end of it, they said, we don't want the evaluation. No, we don't want it anymore. And they were really upset. They were so upset. They were like, we can see now, we did the wrong thing. It was never going to work. It's no point evaluating it. We're not going to get there. We're going to start again and start a new strategy and skip the evaluation. And it made me realize that it is, if you haven't got a clear theory of change at the beginning, you can really bark up the wrong tree. You can waste a lot of resources. So yes, you can retrofit your theory of change. You might end up crying. You might end up realizing that you can't get to your outcomes with the activities you've got. I prefer to know that halfway through and change the program than to find out at the end. So you can do it. You can stick the activities in the bottom, clarify the outcomes, and just try and make a pathway up. Maybe you'll be lucky and you've found out you've got a really good design, but you may find out that you haven't, and that's where you're going to be. Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. Damien, any additional comments?
I mean, I think apart from this, the fact that it is frustrating, but it can be a journey as well. Journey with working with the donors and all the and the program team, and you might not be able to retrofit a really good theory of change straight away, but progressively, if you keep having that discussion and the journey and explain why doing a straight retrofit, trying to match what they've already got, may not be really useful. That's what you might do initially, but keep having that discussion and demonstrate that, look, there's an opportunity to pivot or to change the program a bit to really get a better outcome at the end.
Thanks, Damien. Probably time for one more quick question before we finish up. Some programs are so complex that even a simplified theory of change ends up looking like a spaghetti diagram. How do you deal with such super complex theory of changes without asking program staff to invest days of their time working with them?
Well, I think if you've got a complex program, at some level you're going to have to embrace the complexity and get with it. So I used to try and make them simple all the time, and I've sort of given up that, and I'm more now embracing complexity. If it's a simple program, we'll have a simple theory of change. If it's a complex thing, it's going to need a more complex theory of change. But what I do think is that you can develop a big, complex, messy one. You can always simplify it down. And like Lauren says, have two versions. Have a workhorse of a version that the staff use that's got lots of detail in it. You can simplify that up and have a simpler version for other people. If you want to save time, you can do some of the work or develop a rough version of it with a few people and then share it with more people, and that can be an efficient way. People love critiquing them. So if one group develop it, the next group, you narrate it to them and they go, that's wrong, and that's wrong. You can fix it up and you can be efficient, but don't hide from the complexity if it's really there.
My quick answer would be just, you can have a nested approach. Have a simple theory of change, and then within specific outcomes that can be broken down into a sub theory of change, things like that. That's how you can hide that.
Or even package it up into a log frame, Damien.
Right at the project level.
I actually disagree. I think you can explain anything simply. Randall Munroe is a cartoonist in the US. He has a comic strip called XKCD, and he has a book where he explains complex scientific theories, and he only has a vocabulary of 1,000 words to use to describe the very complex theories, and he pulled it off. I have the book, on my desk, but I haven't seen my desk for a long time.
So it's a good aim to pull out the simplicity, and sometimes you can't do it all in one diagram. That's something I've learned from designers, is they show different contexts. I think we've run out of time, haven't we?
We are out of time. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining me. And thank you all audience members for coming along. Really appreciate your questions, really great questions. Just very quickly, a cheeky plug for a course that we have coming up that may be of interest to you. We've got a course called Measurement, Evaluation and Learning that's kicking off on the 6th of July. And that has 3 weeks of dedicated focus on theory of change. So if you liked what you saw and you want a bit more of a deep dive in theory of change, definitely recommend coming along to that. I'm going to ask Keisha to share the space where you can log in, so you can sign up and register for the course. We're also offering all of the participants in today's webinar a discount. If you type in webinar when you register for the course, you'll get a discount on your course fee.
I think it's filling up fast as well, so you might not make it into this one, but we'll do it again soon.
Yeah, there's only 3 weeks to register for this one. We'll be launching another one later on in the year. So I believe the link has been added to that in the chat room there. So check that out, and thanks for your time, panelists, again, and see you all hopefully at another webinar.
Thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed it.